Hello everyone! In this video we're going to do an overpaint. Basically an overpaint is taking one picture and to change a few things to improve it. At least I hope so. In this overpaint we're going from this picture to this one. Do you think it improved it? Do you think it didn't? Please leave it in the comment box. In this overpaint we're going to change different things, but my focus is going to be contrast. So what is contrast? Contrast is the keystone of vision. Our eyes always want more contrast. It is satisfactory. Same thing happens to artists. At some point during our painting, our eyes is going to trick us and they're going to ask for more contrast. With that, instead of this result, we can get to this. Our job is to learn how to see differently and to use those subtleties in our favor. I'm talking about subtleties. Did you get my books? Link in the description. In this video we're going to analyze this picture and find out how making some changes, especially in contrast, but also in color, shading, brush strokes and texture, we can get to a more subtle and natural result. I don't want to mess it up anymore, so let's go to it. This picture is fine, but we can do certain things to make the contrast a lot better. Our eyes can be easily fooled in the moment of creating contrast. In here we can see some very bright spots, very close to very dark areas. Obviously our eyes want to have a very good contrast, but we have to be very aware of how much contrast we are going to create. We want to have some very light and shiny areas, of course, and of course we want to have some very dark areas almost going to black. But we also want to have midtones. We have those light areas and those dark areas, but we practically don't have midtones to create a transition between them. So during this overpaint, we're going to work towards creating a better harmony in this picture. Darks, lights, but also midtones. With the Gaussian blur, we can see how the lights and the darks spread, creating a more harmonious picture with a better contrast. Apart from the contrast, another thing that I want to check in this picture is colors, or better, color saturation. When we sample the skin colors, we can notice that the light skin color has a very good saturation, but as we go to the dark colors, they go to the dark colors very close to black and even a little bit going towards the gray. Whenever we color skin, we want our dark colors to saturate before they go to the dark colors. Most colors in here are very desaturated, almost going to the grayish side. So we're attempting to make some improvements by improving the contrast, but also the saturation. Something else I want to improve that is possibly a personal preference is brush strokes. We can see how most of the picture was constructed using basically airbrushes and possibly some breaks that could be better applied. They were used in a very linear way in some areas, creating a very aggressive texture. That makes the hair look very unnatural. Dual brush for blending. This picture has a lot of potential, taking advantage of one of the newest Procreate functions. Let's keep in mind that this blur picture is around the look that I want to get. The first fix I want to do in this picture is the nose. It bothers me a bit that this part over here is so extremely thin. We're going to improve the color saturation. We can choose the base color and move to the right and down to create a more saturated shade color. We always move diagonally. Of course, it's important to keep those dark shades wherever they should be. I'm making sure that the darkest colors will be located closest to the areas that are going to have a very dark shadow. I will try to make sure that all the darkest colors are going to be very close to the darkest areas. The rest of the space will be solved using midtones. A picture is never too serious as to not adding some bright colors to it. Whenever I have rounded areas, I want the transitions to be very soft. However, when I want to have a more angular shape, the transition is going to be much more aggressive. Whenever I paint traditionally, I especially use flat brushes. So when it's time to paint digitally, I also use my flat brushes. This one is called Nico Roll, but I modified it to make it flatter and to rotate with tilt. Close to the nose, I want the eyes to have a very dark shadow, but in the outer part, I want it to be much lighter. Everything in the eye is so dark that we don't even have an eyelid. So let's paint an eyelid. I want here to show that this is the edge of the lower eyelid, but let's do it in a more subtle way. Changing the saturation and value in between the eyes create the sensation of more space in between the eyes. Normally the nose receives a lot of reflections from the environment, especially in the bottom area. The nose doesn't need to be so rounded. Using some more straight lines, we can stylize it and make it look more interesting. We can always add a secondary light. With it, we can illuminate some dark areas so we can bring back the detail in those areas. This secondary light is going to show the most in the darkest areas in the picture. We can darken the neck much more. Possibly the red color in the lips is too saturated and the edge is too sharp, so I'm going to soften the color and the edge. We can also soften the highlights. By using this rake as a blending brush, I can bring some texture to the picture, creating kind of a hatching texture that is very convenient to create transitions. The horns may look much better if they are much darker. They can be mostly black, and we can concentrate all the light areas and the highlights in just one area. Much darker horns give a better effect. We can get a similar effect in the hair, making it much darker. Also about the hair, the lines around it are too thick and too notorious. They look too much made with a special brush, and that's something we don't want. We're going to soften the lines to show that hair texture in a much softer way. For that, I will use my Wiseguss irregular rake, which is the same this person did, but in a softer and more natural way. The secondary light will also show on the hair and also in the lower part of the horn. It might be very shiny. The top part can be a bluish gray, following the direction of the roundness of the horns. We want a very dark hair, but the top of it should have some illumination. The brush I'm using for blending here is a dual brush that I created recently. If you want to know how I did it, you can watch the process as a short here in YouTube or in TikTok. I can notice now that her face traits changed a bit, so I will organize them to make them look more like the reference. As I mentioned from the beginning, the idea in this overpaint was not to make big changes in the illustration, but better to adjust some things in it, especially in the contrast and in the color saturation, as well as improving some details in shapes and brush strokes. I hope I made it right. I softened some shapes, and I made some improvements in the anatomy, all with the goal to make it look much more natural. My focus was to make all this round area around her head to be the brightest spot. Everything else is going to be much darker. In her face, most of this area is going to be in light. We have some areas with a very low contrast, again to soften her face features. I kept a very high contrast in the bottom part of her nose, in the corner between the eyes and the nose. I tried to keep the shape of the bottom eyelid, in which I clearly show the bottom part as the darkest area. The top plane is much lighter, and there is a highlight across the edge. Corners of her eyes and her cheeks, and possibly her chin, are the areas with the most contrast in her face. Possibly without the dark eyes and the blood coming from them, it would have been a very delicate face. I changed the angle of her mouth, so it had a nicer angle and a slightly upwards end. I created some highlights on her hair and the horns using some very texturized brushes. I used some secondary lights to show some areas that were lost in the original picture. I showed her eyelash, the bottom of her eyelid, even a reflection in the eye, in the bottom side of her cheek, and the edge of her face, and even some of the shapes in her hair. I'm going to work in her body to do pretty much the same. Everything is going to be darker, especially in the bottom, and she's going to have some light in the top areas, like in her shoulders or her chest. I'm using a texture brush to blend the colors. For the lightest areas in her body, I'm choosing a shade color in her face. I will put this color on her shoulders and in the central part of the clavicles. For coloring and for some blending, I'm using this brush called Buzz, which is a brush that comes with Procreate, and you can find it in the vintage brushes. It is a very interesting brush, especially used as a blender brush, because it leaves marks similar to hatching that create a nice shading effect. We want the chest to be light. I will even include some of the light tones from the forehead, but in a much smaller area and in a much softer way. I'm using mostly my rake brushes to create some hair in the front of her body. I think sometimes we take the hair too lightly. We do it at the end of the painting. We want to finish the painting already. But sometimes we need to take it more seriously, because it complements very well a nice picture. It can make a nice picture look even better. If you like the result, if you like the process, let me know in the comments below. Since you're there, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, share it with someone who can find this content useful. If you like your picture overpainted, let me know in the comments below, but also DM me through Instagram. It's still free, but possibly not for a long time. See you in the next video. Adios.